People love saying that money can't buy happiness. At 25 years old, I thought they were just making excuses. My name is Ethan Carter, and I had everything most people spend their entire lives chasing. 5 years earlier, I had built a software company from my tiny college dorm room with nothing but an old laptop, too much caffeine, and a dream that refused to die. What started as a late-night coding project had exploded into one of the fastest-growing tech startups in the country. By 25, my company was worth millions. My face appeared in business magazines, and investors treated every word that came out of my mouth like it was gospel. Success changed everything. I drove the cars I once admired through dealership windows. I lived in a modern glass mansion overlooking the city skyline. My beautiful wife, Sarah, loved the glamorous life just as much as I did. Luxury vacations, designer clothes, expensive restaurants. It felt like we were living inside a dream that would never end. Standing beside me through it all was my best friend Mark. We'd met during our first semester in college, surviving sleepless nights and failed projects together before eventually building the company side by side. If someone had asked me who I trusted most in the world, I wouldn't have hesitated. Mark, not even for a second. The night everything began to unravel, we hosted the biggest product launch in our company's history. Hundreds of investors, journalists, and business leaders filled the ballroom, celebrating another record-breaking year. Cameras flashed non-stop while people congratulated me for becoming one of the youngest successful CEOs in the industry. My parents came too. They looked completely out of place among the designer suits and luxury watches. My father quietly smiled and placed a hand on my shoulder. Success doesn't last forever, son, he said, save for the rainy days. I laughed. Dad, I replied, it's never going to rain. He smiled, but there was sadness in his eyes. Later that evening, Mark walked over carrying a stack of legal documents. Nothing important, he said with a grin. Just routine restructuring paperwork our lawyers need before tomorrow. Without reading a single page, I signed every document he placed in front of me. Why wouldn't I? He was my best friend. As the party continued, I stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights, convinced I had built a life that could never be taken away. That night, I went to bed believing I was the luckiest man alive. I had no ideas. It would be the last peaceful night of my life. Monday morning began like every other. I pulled into the company parking lot with a cup of coffee in one hand and a presentation for our next expansion in the other. Employees walked past me without making eye contact, which felt strange, but I ignored it. I stepped toward the entrance and tapped my keycard against the scanner. Access denied. I frowned and tried again. Nothing. Before I could ask what was happening, 2 security guards approached me. Mr. Carter, one of them said awkwardly, we've been instructed not to let you inside. I laughed, thinking it was some kind of joke. Then my phone rang. It was Mark. I answered immediately. Mark, what the hell is going on? His voice was calm. Exactly what you signed on Saturday. My smile disappeared. The restructuring documents legally transferred your controlling shares, voting rights, and every piece of intellectual property to my holding company. I couldn't speak. You as your lyings. No, he replied, you just never bothered to read what you signed. He continued as if he were discussing the weather. I've spent the last 6 months preparing for this. The investors already believe you're reckless, the board thinks you're unstable, and by this afternoon they'll officially vote to remove you as CEO. My hands started shaking. You planned this. For months. Then he ended the call. I don't remember driving home. All I could think about was Sarah. She would understand. She'd tell me this was just a misunderstanding. I threw open the front door. The house was filled with moving boxes. Sarah stood in the hallway holding a suitcase. For a brief moment, I thought she was helping me pack so we could leave together. Then I noticed Mark's expensive watch sitting on the kitchen counter. Sarah looked at me without a trace of emotion. I'm leaving. I stared at her, unable to process the words. Ethan, I didn't marry you to struggle. My heart sank. You know. She nodded. I've known about Mark's plan for weeks. Every word felt like another knife. He has the company now, he has the future, and I'm not throwing my life away because you were careless. Tears filled my eyes. So you're choosing him. She zipped up her suitcase. I already did. She walked past me without looking back. Standing outside the front door was Mark. He smiled, put an arm around my wife, and together they walked toward his car. In less than 12 hours, I had lost my company, my best friend, and the woman I believed would stand beside me forever. The weeks that followed were a slow-motion disaster. Lawsuits tied up everything that still carried my name. My personal accounts were frozen while the legal battle dragged on, leaving me with almost nothing. The bank repossessed my house, the luxury cars disappeared from the driveway, and every headline painted Mark as the brilliant businessman who had saved the company from my reckless leadership. The worst part wasn't losing the money. It was watching people disappear. The same friends who once begged to have dinner with me suddenly stopped answering my calls. Investors who used to praise my vision pretended they barely knew me. Everyone had chosen a side. And winners always attract more people than losers. With nowhere else to go, I packed the few clothes I had left and drove back to the small house where I grew up. My parents welcomed me without asking a single question. My old bedroom looked exactly the same as it had years ago, except now it felt painfully small. Every morning I woke up staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering how my entire life had collapsed in a single day. I replayed every conversation with Mark, every smile from Sarah, every signature I had carelessly written. If I had read those documents, if I had listened to my father, maybe none of this would have happened. Days turned into weeks. I barely left my rooms. Then one evening, my father quietly walked in and sat beside me on the bed. For a long time, neither of us said anything. Finally, he looked at me and spoke. "They took your money, son." He paused before placing a hand on my shoulder. "Don't let them take your pride too." Those words hit harder than everything I'd experienced over the past month. For the first time since losing everything, I realized I wasn't just hurting myself anymore. My parents were buying my groceries, paying my bills, and watching their son slowly disappear into self-pity. Mark had taken my company. Sarah had taken my heart. But I was the one choosing to stay on that bed. That night I made a promise to myself. I couldn't change what they had done. But I could decide what happened next. Tomorrow, I was going to get out of that room and start earning my life back. The next morning, I updated my resume for the first time in years. Every application I sent to technology companies came back with the same answer. Rejected. Some companies didn't even bother replying. Others quietly admitted that nobody wanted to hire the man who had just been publicly thrown out of his own company. Realities hit me hard. Bills didn't care about my pride. So I swallowed it. A week later, I walked into a small 24-hour diner on the edge of town. The owner, Frank, was a gruff man in his 60s who barely looked up from the grill as he read my application. "You ever cooked before?" I shook my head. "You willing to learn?" "Oh, yes." He tossed me a black apron. "Be here at 6 tonight." That was my interview. The first few weeks were brutal. My hands, once used to keyboards and expensive laptops, were now covered in small burns and cuts. My back ached after every shift, and by the time I reached home each morning, I could barely climb the stairs to my old bedroom. One Friday night, just before midnight, the front door opened. A group of well-dressed businessmen walked in. I recognized every one of them. Former investors, old acquaintances, people who used to shake my hand at networking events. One of them looked at me and laughed. "Isn't that Ethan?" Another smiled. I guess coding didn't work out. They made sure I heard every joke as I served their food. Each sarcastic comment felt like another reminder of everything I had lost. For a moment, I wanted to throw my apron on the floor and walk out forever. Instead, I refilled their drinks, thanked them when they left, and quietly cleaned the crumbs from their table after they were gone. As humiliating as it was, something inside me changed that night. For the first time in my life, my job wasn't about titles, stock prices, or magazine covers. It was simply about doing honest work the best I could. Frank noticed the way I handled the situation. As we closed the diner that morning, he handed me my paycheck. "You know," he said, locking the front door, "real leaders aren't the ones giving orders." He nodded toward the empty dining room. "They're the ones who keep showing up when nobody's clapping." Those words stayed with me all the way home. I had lost my company because I believed success made me important. standing in that greasy apron, exhausted after another night shift. I was finally beginning to understand what real success actually looked like. A few months passed, and the diner slowly became more than just a place where I earned a paycheck. I knew the regular customers by name, remembered their favorite meals, and even found myself smiling again without forcing it. That's when I first noticed the woman who always sat alone at corner table 3. Every night around 10, she would walk in carrying a backpack full of books, order a cup of black coffee, and spend hours studying in complete silence. Her name was Alina. Unlike most customers, she never seemed interested in small talk. But one evening, after noticing the programming book tucked under my arm during my break, she looked up from her laptop and asked, "You code?" That simple question turned into our first real conversation. Over the next few weeks, we spoke more often. She was finishing her master's degree in supply chain management, incredibly intelligent and surprisingly easy to talk to. One night, I casually mentioned that I used to own a technology company. Even after everything that had happened, there was still a trace of bitterness in my voice. I expected the usual reaction: shock, sympathy, or curiosity. Instead, Alina simply shrugged. "That's who you were," she said, "not who you are." I frowned. She closed her notebook and looked directly at me. "You keep talking about everything you lost. Have you noticed you never talk about what you're going to build next?" Her words caught me completely off guard. After that night, it became a routine. When my shift ended just before sunrise, we'd grab 2 coffees and walk quietly through the nearly empty streets. I would tell her about software ideas, problems businesses still faced, and products I wished existed. She never asked about Mark. She never asked about Sarah. She wasn't interested in the tragedy that had destroyed my life. She was interested in the person who could create something new. For the first time in over a year, someone believed in me without caring how much money I had, or what my last name meant in the business world. As I walked beside her one cool morning, watching the sun rise over the city, I realized something that both frightened and excited me. I wasn't just looking forward to our conversations anymore. I was looking forward to seeing her. A few weeks later, something at the diner caught my attention. Every night, I watched crates of fresh vegetables, dairy products, and meat being thrown into the trash simply because they had been overordered. At the same time, there were days when we ran out of ingredients before dinner service even began. Frank kept track of everything with handwritten notes and spreadsheets that were always outdated. The engineer inside me couldn't stop thinking about it. "This shouldn't be this hard," I muttered one night while taking out the trash. The next day, I bought a scratched-up second-hand laptop with nearly all the money I'd saved from the diner. When I got home after my 10-hour shifts, instead of going to sleep, I opened my old programming tools for the first time in over a year. At first, I was rusty. Simple problems that once took minutes now took hours. But slowly, it started coming back. Night after night, I wrote code until sunrise, slept for a few hours, then returned to the diner. My body was exhausted, but my mind had never felt more alive. Every completed feature reminded me that Mark had stolen my company. He hadn't stolen my ability to build one. When the first version was finally ready, I showed it to Alina. She spent nearly an hour testing every screen before closing the laptop with a smile. "I've been waiting to see this version of you," she said. I looked at her confused. "The confident ones." She shook her head. "The creator." She leaned forward. "Your talent was never the money, Ethan. It was always what you could create with an empty screen." Her words gave me the confidence I needed. The next evening, I asked Frank if he'd be willing to test the software for free. He laughed. "If it saves me even $100, dinner's on me." A month later, he called me into his office carrying a stack of invoices. "I checked the numbers 3 times, he said. "We've cut food waste by almost 40%. He looked at me with a grin. "This little program just saved me thousands of dollars. For the first time since losing everything. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building again." Frank's Diner became my first success story. The software was saving him money every month, and I truly believed other restaurant owners would see its value too. I spent my days working at the diner and my nights visiting local restaurant chains, giving demonstrations and explaining how my system could reduce food waste and simplify inventory management. Most meetings lasted less than 10 minutes. Some owners weren't interested. Others said they already had suppliers handling everything. A few simply looked at my worn-out clothes and politely showed me the door before I could even finish my presentation. The rejection hurt, but I kept going. Then things became even worse. A former colleague quietly called me one evening. Mark knows you're starting another company. My stomach tightened. He called a few investors and business groups. He's telling everyone you're reckless and impossible to work with. Several regional investor meetings have already removed your name. I thanked him and hung up. For a long time, I just sat there in silence. No matter how hard I worked, Mark could still reach into my future and slam every door shut. That night, I couldn't breathe. The walls of my tiny apartment suddenly felt like they were closing in. My heart raced, my hands trembled, and for the first time since losing the company, I suffered a full panic attack. Maybe Mark had already won. Maybe I'd spend the rest of my life running from a shadow I could never escape. A soft knock came at the door. It was Elena. She took one look at me and immediately understood something was wrong. I told her everything, about the investors, the blacklist, and how it felt like my life was still being controlled by the man who stole it. She listened quietly before asking one simple question. Why are you still trying to play Mark's game? I looked at her confused. She smiled. You're chasing investors because that's how your first company grew. She paused. But the people who actually need your software aren't sitting in expensive boardrooms. They're standing in kitchens. Her words changed everything. The next morning, I stopped chasing wealthy investors. Instead, I drove from one small family-owned restaurant to another, the same hardworking owners I'd met while working at Frank's Diner. I offered them an affordable monthly subscription instead of asking for huge upfront payments. I wasn't building a company for billion-dollar headlines anymore. I was building one customer at a time. And for the first time, the doors started opening. The next 2 years changed my life, not overnight, but one restaurant at a time. Every satisfied owner recommended my software to another. I spent countless mornings standing inside busy kitchens, listening to chefs, managers, and suppliers explain their daily struggles. Unlike before, I wasn't building products from a luxurious office while guessing what customers wanted. I had lived their problems. I'd washed dishes beside them, cleaned tables with them, and worked the same exhausting shifts they did. They trusted me because they knew I understood them. The company grew slowly, but every new customer was earned. We never chased flashy investors or billion-dollar valuations. Every dollar we made came from real businesses paying for a product that genuinely helped them. The growth wasn't explosive, but it was stable, honest, and completely ours. As the workload increased, I hired my first employees. This time, I didn't care about Ivy League degrees or impressive resumes. I wanted people with integrity, people who admitted their mistakes, treated others with respect, and believed in building something meaningful together. Watching that small team work late into the evening reminded me of the early days of my first startup, except now there was no arrogance, no endless pressure to impress investors, and no toxic competition. Eventually, I packed my belongings and moved out of my parents' house into a modest apartment close to the office. Handing my mother the spare house key was an emotional moment. I hugged both of my parents and thanked them for believing in me when I had stopped believing in myself. Around the same time, Alina and I officially became a couple. There was no grand confession or expensive vacation. One evening, after grabbing coffee following a long day at work, I reached for her hand, and she smiled before I could say a single word. Somehow, that simple moment meant more than any luxury I'd ever been able to afford. One night, as I sat alone in my small office after everyone had gone home, I looked around at the worn desks, secondhand computers, and whiteboards covered in ideas. Years ago, I believed success was measured by magazine covers, private jets, and billion-dollar valuations. Now I finally understood the truth. Building something slowly, with people who believed in each other, was worth far more than building something quickly with people who only believed in money. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing success. I was living it. As my company quietly grew, I stopped paying attention to the business news. I no longer cared about rankings, startup valuations, or who had raised the biggest investment round. My focus was on my customers, my team, and building something that would still exist 10 years from now. But the headlines had a way of finding me anyway. One morning, Frank slid a business magazine across the diner counter. You might want to read this. On the front page was a photo of Mark. The headline reads, "Once promising tech giant faces uncertain future." I wasn't surprised. Without the product vision and engineering culture we'd built together years earlier, the company had started drifting. Instead of improving the software, Mark spent millions acquiring flashy startups that brought in headlines but no real value. Quarter after quarter, revenue slowed while expenses exploded. Then came the stories I never expected to hear. Several engineers I'd once worked beside reached out to me, asking if my company was hiring. They spoke about impossible deadlines, constant blame, and a workplace ruled by fear instead of trust. The people who had once believed in our dream were walking away from it. Sarah, meanwhile, had the life she thought she always wanted. The designer handbags, the luxury vacations, the penthouse overlooking the city. But those things couldn't hide what Mark had become. Every failed quarter made him angrier. Every lost employee made him more paranoid. Every board meeting ended with shouting instead of solutions. The confident man she had chosen over me was disappearing, replaced by someone consumed by greed and fear. Industry gossip soon turned into public headlines. The company's valuation fell. Major clients canceled contracts. Investors demanded answers. Even Sarah began appearing less often beside Mark at public events. Rumors of constant arguments and separate living arrangements spread through the business community. For a moment, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Just relief. Because I finally understood something. I hadn't destroyed Mark's life. He was doing that himself. Greed had built his empire. Now it was tearing it apart. And while his world slowly collapsed, mine kept quietly growing. 3 years after I wrote the very first line of code on that second-hand laptop, our company signed the biggest contract in its history. A statewide restaurant association chose our software to power hundreds of businesses across the state. Overnight, our quiet little startup was no longer a hidden success. Business magazines began calling us one of the fastest-growing software companies in the industry. A week later, I received an invitation to the annual Technology Leadership Gala. 4 years ago, I would have attended hoping to impress everyone in the room. This time, I simply wanted to represent my team. Alina stood beside me that evening wearing a simple navy dress. She smiled as she adjusted my tie. Nervous, she asked. I laughed. Not anymore. As we walked into the ballroom, memories came rushing back. The expensive suits, the flashing cameras, the champagne glasses. It looked almost identical to the launch party where I had unknowingly signed my company away. Only this time, I was a different man. Halfway through the evening, I felt someone watching me. I turned around. Across the room stood Mark and Sarah. For the first time in nearly 4 years. Our eyes met. Mark looked nothing like the confident businessman I once admired. His suit was perfectly tailored, but it couldn't hide the exhaustion on his face. Dark circles surrounded his eyes, and every forced smile looked painfully rehearsed. Sarah looked different too. Not older. Just sad. The excitement that once filled her eyes had disappeared, replaced by quiet regret. They slowly began walking toward me. Years ago, I had imagined this moment countless times. I thought I would demand answers. I thought I would finally tell them how much they had destroyed. Instead, I felt absolutely nothing. When they reached me, I simply smiled, gave a polite nod, and said, "Good evenings." Before either of them could speak, I turned back toward Alina and continued our conversation as if nothing had happened. We laughed together, discussing our next product update, while Mark and Sarah stood silently behind us. For the first time since they betrayed me, they understood something I had learned long ago. The greatest victory wasn't proving them wrong. It was no longer needing them to know they were. 3 days after the gala, my assistant knocked on my office door. "Ethan," she said carefully, "there's a woman here asking to see you. She says it's important." I looked through the glass wall overlooking the reception area. It was Sarah. She looked nothing like the woman who had walked out of our house 4 years earlier. The confidence was gone. Her designer clothes couldn't hide the exhaustion on her face, and her eyes were swollen as if she hadn't slept in days. I took a deep breath. "Send her in." She walked into my office slowly, looking around at the busy team working outside. "You've built all of this," she whispered. I simply nodded. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then the tears came. "I'm sorry, Ethan." Her voice cracked. I was selfish. I thought money was everything. I thought Mark was the future. She wiped her eyes, struggling to continue. "I made the biggest mistake of my life." I listened quietly. She stepped closer. I've left him. Her words hung in the air. I know I don't deserve another chance, but maybe we could start over. She smiled through her tears. Remember our first apartment? Remember staying up all night eating cheap pizza while you worked on your first app? We were happy then. I remembered every moment. But strangely, none of it hurt anymore. I looked at Sarah, and for the first time I felt no anger. No resentment. Only sadness. Not for myself. For her. She had spent her life chasing whoever looked like the winner, only to realize too late that character matters more than success. I stood up from my chair. The man you walked away from, I said softly, doesn't exist anymore. She lowered her head. He died the day you chose Mark. A tear rolled down her cheek. I'm sorry. I know, I replied. And I truly hope you find peace. I pressed the small button on my desk. A security officer entered the office a few moments later. I smiled politely. Please walk Ms. Carter to the lobby. Sarah looked at me one last time, hoping I might change my mind. I didn't. She quietly followed security toward the elevator. As the doors closed, I simply turned back to my computer and continued working. Because some chapters of life are meant to stay closed. A month after Sarah walked out of my office, the news everyone in the industry had been expecting finally arrived. Mark's company had officially filed for bankruptcy. The board of directors removed him as CEO after months of financial losses, failed acquisitions, and investor lawsuits. News channels reported that regulators had opened an investigation into financial mismanagement and possible fraud during his leadership. Within days, the man who once stood on magazine covers as a visionary entrepreneur had become the face of one of the biggest corporate collapses of the decade. His money disappeared. His reputation vanished. And Sarah was gone. One quiet evening, I was sitting in my apartment with Alina, enjoying dinner after another ordinary day at work, when my phone buzzed. A voicemail. It was from Mark. I waited until later that night before pressing play. His voice was barely recognizable. He was drunk. At first he blamed everyone else, the investors, the board, the economy. Then his voice broke. Ethan, I'm sorry. Several seconds of silence followed. I thought I could build what you built. Another pause. I was wrong. He took a shaky breath before speaking again. I need your help. If I can't pay my lawyers, I'm going to prison. For a moment, I simply stared at the phone in my hand. Years earlier, I would have dreamed about hearing those words. I imagined how satisfying it would feel to watch the man who destroyed my life beg for mercy. But now, I felt nothing. No excitement. No anger. No desire for revenge. Just acceptance. I quietly deleted the voicemail and placed my phone back on the table. Alina looked at me. Aren't you going to call him back? I smiled and gently shook my head. No, that chapter of my life had already ended. I finally understood that revenge isn't freedom. It keeps you chained to the people who hurt you. Forgiveness doesn't always mean helping someone. Sometimes, it simply means letting them face the consequences of their own choices while you continue walking forward. And that's exactly what I intended to do. A few months later, our company reached a milestone I once believed defined success. The latest valuation placed us higher than the company I had lost years before. Reporters wanted interviews, investors wanted meetings, and business magazines once again wanted my story. This time, I politely declined most of them. Instead, I made a reservation at a quiet restaurant and invited the two people who had never stopped believing in me. My parents. As dinner came to an end, I placed a small envelope on the table. My mother looked at me curiously while my father adjusted his glasses. Inside was the deed to a beautiful house. Completely paid for. For a moment, neither of them spoke. My mother's eyes filled with tears. My father looked at the papers, then at me. You bought this for us. I nodded. When I lost everything, you gave me a home without asking for anything in return. You fed me when I couldn't feed myself. You believed in me when I had stopped believing in myself. My voice began to shake. I can never repay you for that, but I wanted to try. My father stood up and hugged me tighter than he ever had before. When he finally stepped back, tears were running down his face. "You know something, son." I smiled. I'm prouder of the young man who worked those night shifts in the diner than I ever was of the millionaire CEO. Those words meant more to me than every award I'd ever received. Later that evening, I asked Alina to take one more walk with me. Not through a luxury resort. Not on a private beach. We walked beneath the same streetlights where we'd shared coffee after my diner shifts, back when my future was nothing more than an old laptop and a dream. I stopped where our very first morning walk had ended. Then I knelt down. Not with the biggest diamond. Not with a crowd watching. Just with complete honesty. "Alina," I said, "you believed in me when all I had was hope. Will you spend the rest of your life building this future with me?" She smiled through tears before I had even finished asking. "Oh, yes." As I slipped the ring onto her finger, I realized something that no contract, lawsuit, or betrayal could ever change. Years ago, I thought wealth was measured by money. Standing there beside the woman I loved, with my parents smiling only a few streets away, I finally understood what true wealth really looked like. And this time, it was something no one could ever steal. A year later, I stood alone in the boardroom of my new company. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the same city I once believed had forgotten me. Employees moved through the office outside, laughing, discussing ideas, and building a future together. It was everything I had dreamed of years ago, but somehow it felt completely different. I smiled as I remembered the 25-year-old version of myself. The young man who thought expensive cars proved success. Who believed titles made him important. Who trusted signatures more than people. Losing everything had felt like the end of my life. Now I understood. It had been the beginnings. Mark stole my company. Sarah walked away when life became difficult. At the time, I thought they had destroyed me. But looking back, I realized something I never could have understood then. Their betrayal forced me to become the man standing here today. A better leader. A better son. A better husband. Most importantly, a better human being. People still occasionally asked me what happened to Mark, or whether Sarah had ever tried to contact me again. The truth was, I honestly didn't know. Not because I was pretending not to care. Because I had stopped thinking about them a long time ago. Holding on to hate would have meant carrying them with me forever. I had chosen something far more valuable. Please. A knock on the glass door interrupted my thoughts. My team was waiting for the weekly meeting. Some of them had joined when we could barely afford second-hand computers. Others had come later, attracted not by salaries, but by the culture we had built together. I looked at each of them and smiled. This wasn't just a company. It was a family built on trust, respect, and loyalty. I took one last look at the skyline before turning away from the window. Years ago, I thought success meant standing at the top of the mountain. I was wrong. Success wasn't reaching the summit. It was becoming the kind of person who deserved to stand there. I walked into the meeting room, greeted my team, and got back to work. Because the greatest revenge isn't making the people who hurt you suffer. It's building a life so meaningful that one day you realize you haven't thought about them in years. And that is the moment you truly win.